The morning after the killing frost, the whole valley woke to black. Every field in Callaway lay flat and dead. Every vine, every row, every careful thing a farmer had tended since April gone in a single clear night the way a candle goes when someone opens a door. But on the north hill above the frost line something refused to die. A wall of river stone broad and south-facing wore 100 red tomatoes like embers nobody had thought to put out. Ripe, whole, warm to the touch at 6 in the morning after the coldest night in 13 years. A 22-year-old woman stood in front of that wall with her palm flat against the rock and her eyes on the dead valley below. She had no husband, no hired hand, no family left in Callaway. What she had was a debt, 3 acres of hill that everyone said a woman alone couldn't work, and something her grandmother pressed into her hands, the only way old women pass things down. Not in words, in a gesture, a palm against warm stone, a voice low and certain. The rock doesn't lose the heat, Nora. It keeps it, quiet and long and without any fuss. The valley had lost everything that night. Her wall had not. And one man had spent the whole summer making sure it would. The morning after the killing frost, the whole valley woke to black. Every field in Callaway lay flat and dead. Every vine, every row, every careful thing a farmer had tended since April gone in a single clear night, the way a candle goes when someone opens a door. But on the north hill above the frost line, something refused to die. A wall of river stone, broad and south-facing, wore 100 red tomatoes like embers nobody had thought to put out. Ripe, whole, warm to the touch at 6 in the morning after the coldest night in 13 years. A 22-year-old woman stood in front of that wall with her palm flat against the rock and her eyes on the dead valley below. She had no husband, no hired hand, no family left in Callaway. What she had was a debt, 3 acres of hill that everyone said a woman alone couldn't work, and something her grandmother pressed into her hands, the only way old women pass things down. Not in words, in a gesture, a palm against warm stone, a voice low and certain. The rock doesn't lose the heat, Nora. It keeps it, quiet and long and without any fuss. The valley had lost everything that night. Her wall had not, and one man had spent the whole summer making sure it would. 8 months earlier, the ground was soft with snowmelt and the cabin smelled like cedar and old wool in the particular silence that follows a burial. Nora Vane had been home for 11 days. 11 days of neighbors stopping by with covered dishes and careful faces. 11 days of sitting at the plank table with her grandmother's ledger open in front of her, running the same numbers over and over, hoping they'd change. They didn't. 3 acres of rocky slope above the Callaway Gorge. A cabin of fitted river stone with a broad south wall and a crooked east shutter. A box of seed tins lined along the windowsill like small copper soldiers, each one labeled in faded pencil. And a debt at Greer's Mercantile that had been growing quietly for 3 years, like a weed nobody pulled. Nora was 22 years old. She had her grandmother's cheekbones and her grandmother's stubbornness, and approximately $14 to her name. Agnes Vane had been the last of the old Callaway settlers, born on the trail west, raised in a sod house on the high plains, crossed the Cascades in a wagon that lost 2 wheels and a mule, and arrived at the gorge with a coat hem full of tomato seeds and a jaw set like a door someone had nailed shut. She built the cabin herself with river stone and river mud and the help of exactly one neighbor who owed her a favor. She farmed 3 acres of hillside that every sensible person in the valley said faced the wrong direction and froze too early and wasn't worth the trouble. She farmed it for 40 years, and she left it to Nora. Not because Nora was the oldest or the strongest or the most prepared, because Nora was the one who stayed. The others had gone to Portland, to Salem, to wherever young people go when a valley starts to feel like a closing door. Nora had stayed because Agnes asked her to. Because there was something in the old woman's voice that made leaving feel like abandonment, and because if she was honest, she had nowhere else in particular to be. She hadn't expected the debt. She hadn't expected how quiet the cabin would be. She sat at the plank table on the 12th morning with the ledger and the seed tins and Agnes's handwriting everywhere on the labels and the margins on a folded note tucked inside the front cover that said only, Look at the south wall, child. Really look. Nora folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and went outside. Silas Greer came up the hill that same afternoon. She heard the buggy before she saw it. The creak of good leather, the particular self-importance of a horse that knows it belongs to someone with money. She was standing in the yard with her hands dirty from pulling winter deadfall off the kitchen garden when he stepped down, watch chain catching the light hat in his hand like a man performing courtesy. Silas Greer was not an old man, not yet. Somewhere in his 50s, broad through the shoulders with a soft mouth and careful eyes and the kind of stillness that isn't calm so much as controlled. He ran Greer's Mercantile. He held paper on half the farms in the gorge, and he had, by the account of everyone Nora had ever spoken to, been very good to Agnes Vane, which was the first thing she didn't believe. Not right away, just a feeling, the way a floorboard gives under your foot before it breaks. Miss Vane, he smiled. I came to pay my respects. Agnes was a fixture in this valley. We'll all feel her absence. Thank you, Nora said. She waited. He looked at the cabin, at the slope, at the 3 acres of stony ground with the air of a man doing arithmetic. I also wanted to speak plainly, he said. This hill is cold ground. Your grandmother managed it because she'd been managing it her whole life. But a young woman alone starting from scratch. He spread his hands. I'd feel I'd done you a disservice if I didn't offer. I'll take the land off your hands at fair value. Clear the debt entirely. You'd walk away clean. Nora looked at him. He was still smiling. She thought about Agnes in the ground 11 days, and this man already up her hill. Thank you, she said again. I'll think on it. He left. She went inside and stood at the table and did not think on it for even a single second. What she thought was he came too soon. And a man who comes too soon is a man who's been waiting. She slept badly that night. And the next, not from grief, though there was grief, from arithmetic. The debt was real. The land was cold and rocky and faced the wrong direction according to everyone who knew anything about farming in the gorge. She had seed potatoes and some winter squash, and about 6 weeks before she needed to decide what she was planting and where and how she was going to make any of it add up. She walked the 3 acres every morning, slowly, the way Agnes had taught her, not looking for what was there, looking for what she hadn't seen yet. It was on the 5th morning that she noticed the oven, not the actual oven inside. She'd used that plenty. What she noticed was the chimney stack on the outside of the south wall. She put her hand on it at 7 in the morning, 20 minutes after the breakfast fire had died down. And the stone was still warm. Not hot. Warm. She stood there with her palm flat to the stone and remembered Agnes doing the same thing years ago, pulling her child hand to the chimney rock and saying, "Feel that. Heat doesn't vanish, Nora. It hides. It waits in things that hold it." She'd been 9 years old. She'd half listened. She turned and looked at the broad south wall of the cabin, full exposure from east to west across the whole arc of the sky. Stone a foot thick, warmer than anywhere else in the yard, even in February, because it spent every daylight hour drinking in the sun and spent every night slowly breathing it back out. Like a banked fire. Like a slow-burning thing. And the cold, she knew, ran the other direction. She'd watched it for years without understanding it. The frost always hit the bottomland first. Always pooled in the low fields. The old men at the Mercantile talked about it like it was weather. Cold rolls downhill and pools, they said. Nothing to do but plant late and pray. Cold rolls downhill, and her south wall sat above the cold pool, breathing warmth into the dark. She stood in front of that wall for a long time. She wasn't ready to say the idea out loud yet, even to herself. But she put her hand flat against the stone and kept it there until the chill left her fingers. She planted 6 seedlings at the base of that wall 3 weeks later. Just as an experiment. Just to see. She told herself that. She planted 2 long rows of tomatoes in the open ground as well, the way Agnes always had, the sensible way, the way everyone planted. That was the real crop. The wall plants were just curiosity. She told herself that too. She went to the Mercantile that same week for seed potatoes and wire and a pound of cut nails, and that was the first time she heard about the Dowd man. The blacksmith's, not the Mercantile. She went to Ketterly's smithy on the far end of Callaway's main street because it was closer and because she'd rather talk to a tradesman than to Silas Greer's counterboy. But Ketterly had sold the shop the previous fall, she found out, and the new man hadn't been in the valley long enough for most people to have an opinion about him. He was standing at the forge with his back to the door when she came in. Tall, lean in the way of men who work with their hands rather than wish they did. A child of about 6 was sitting on an upturned crate in the corner watching a cat that wanted nothing to do with her. Nora stated her order: cut nails, a dozen eye hooks, 2 lengths of iron rod if he had them. He turned around. Not an old face, not a young one either. Somewhere in the middle, with the particular expression of a man who has had something taken from him and learned to keep moving anyway. "What are you building?" he said. "Trellis. On stone. Against the south wall of my cabin. Stone holds the warmth." He looked at her for a moment. Not measuring, just thinking. "Sensible," he said. "Nobody'll see it till it works. Then they'll all want one." Something in Nora's chest unknotted slightly. "Eli Dowd," he said and put out a hand. "Nora Vane." He nodded. "Agnes's girl." "Her granddaughter." "Same thing," he said not unkindly. "She talked about you." Nora didn't ask what Agnes had said. She wasn't sure she was ready to know. The child on the crate had given up on the cat and was now watching Nora with open curiosity. "That's Ada," Eli said. "She won't bite." "I might," Ada said. Nora looked at the child, then at Eli. "I see the resemblance." He smiled. It went all the way to his eyes in a way that Nora filed away somewhere and didn't look at directly. She collected her hardware and drove home and told herself that was that. She went back 2 weeks later for more hooks. She told herself it was just the hooks. The trellis went up through the first 3 weeks of June. Slowly at first, the way any new thing is slow before you understand what you're doing. She pulled the old barrel hoops from the shed at the east edge of the property, iron bands from broken cooperage, useless for barrels curved and strong and exactly the right size. She drove them flat to the mortar joints with cut nails, a row of iron ribs against the south face. Between them she strung twine in a loose grid vertical and horizontal until the whole wall wore a web fine enough to hold a climbing vine. It took the skin off 3 of her knuckles. It made her arms ache to the shoulder. She did it anyway because the 6 seedlings at the base of the wall were already twice the height of the row plants in the open ground, and she had looked at that difference and made a decision she wasn't ready to say out loud. She was going to do the whole wall, all of it, every inch. The sensible row crop could stay. She would not be stupid about this, but the wall was getting everything she had. She moved the best seedlings up from the ground rows and transplanted them to the foot of the trellis on a Tuesday morning while the dew was still on the grass. 20 plants, then 30. She trained them by hand every evening, walking the wall with a basket of cut twine, tying the day's new growth gently to the iron ribs, and the string web spreading each plant flat and wide so no leaf shaded another. The vines took to it the way water takes to a slope, like they'd been waiting for permission to stand up. Eli came by the following Wednesday. Not to bring anything. Not for any stated reason. He just appeared at the edge of the property around 3 in the afternoon with Ada on the seat beside him, looked at the wall for a while, said, "You'll want a few more hooks along the top course," and then got to work. She didn't ask him to stay for supper. He didn't ask too. But when she came out with 2 cups of coffee at 6 o'clock, he was still there, sitting on the porch step, and Ada was chasing the cabin cat through the bean rows, and the evening had a quality she didn't have a word for. Settled, maybe? Like something that had been slightly wrong for a long time had quietly corrected itself. She told herself it was just the hooks. Wednesday became the rhythm of that summer, not by agreement, just by repetition, the way a path forms where enough people walk. Eli came. Ada chased the cat. Something got fixed or built or carried. Coffee at 6. And Nora began to understand that a person showing up week after week without being asked was a rarer and more serious thing than almost anything spoken out loud. The mockery started in July. She'd expected it. She dreaded it, which is not the same as being ready for it. On a Thursday morning, Mabel Octor drove past in her cart and slowed to look at the green wall and called out in a voice designed to carry, "Growing your supper up the side of the house now, Nora Vane. Next you'll be planting the roof." Nora smiled and waved and went inside and stood at the window with her fists clenched and her jaw tight. She went back out 20 minutes later and tied 6 more vines. The boys from the Bottomland farms made a point of detouring past on their way to the swimming hole. Wallweed, they called her. Tomato ivy. A knot of women near the church wagons went quiet when she passed and then laughed in the particular way that means they wanted her to hear it. One evening after supper, she sat at the plank table with her ledger and wrote across the top of the July page in her grandmother's style of capital letters that meant a thing mattered. The wall does not care what they call it. She kept the ledger. Agnes had kept the ledger, and Agnes had trained her to it. Every date, every weather note, every height measurement, every anomaly. Nora added to it the way she tied the vines carefully every evening as the light went long and gold through the south window. July 12th. Wall plants at 4 feet. Row plants at 18 inches. Warm night. Wall stone warm to the hand at 10 p.m. July 19th. Wall plants pushing past the second course of iron. First yellow flowers. Row plants barely setting bud. July 27th. Ada found a toad under the bean rows and named it Greer. I did not discourage this. That last line she almost crossed out, then left it. Because it was true, and because the ledger was private, and because something small and hot had been burning in her chest since the afternoon she heard Silas Greer's voice through the mercantile wall. She'd gone in for flour. Early July, Greer's counterboy was out and she heard voices from the back room. Greer's in another she didn't recognize. Not arguing, just talking. The specific quiet talk of men who don't expect to be heard. Just one sentence reached her through the shelving. Agnes Vane said no to me for 15 years. The granddaughter is just time. Nora stood in the aisle with her hand on the flour sack and her face arranged into nothing. She paid for the flour and walked out and drove home and sat at the table for a long time without moving. Just time. He wasn't waiting for the debt to come due. He wasn't doing her a kindness. He had been waiting for Agnes to die. And now he was waiting for Nora to fail. They were the same wait, just in 2 different seasons. She opened the ledger and wrote it down. She wrote everything down after that, including the day in late July when she saw Eli's face. He arrived on Wednesday looking like a man who'd made a decision about something difficult. He waited until Ada was in the bean rows with the toad before he spoke. Greer came by the forge, he said. Tuesday. Nora kept tying vines. Said he'd see about extending my equipment note if I stopped coming up here. She tied another vine. And I told him I wasn't interested. She stopped, looked at him. He was looking at the wall. He'll make it harder for you, she said. Probably. You didn't have to tell me. I know. She went back to the vine in her hand. But something had shifted. Not the kind of shift that announces itself, the quiet kind. The kind that means something you built on a shaky foundation just got a little more solid. Eli. Yeah, thank you. He nodded once, picked up his pliers, got back to work. And the Wednesdays kept coming. The wall kept climbing. And Silas Greer kept waiting the way a man waits when he believes time is on his side. He didn't know yet what Nora knew, that her grandmother had left her something far more important than a wall. She found it on a Sunday in late July when the heat was thick and the tomatoes had started blushing at the bottom, and she was restacking the seed tins to check for weevils. Behind the last tin, pushed flat against the cabin wall, was a small envelope the color of old cream, her name on the front in Agnes's handwriting. Inside, a single folded card, and pressed in the center, dried flat, a sprig of something she didn't recognize at first. Small leaves, a faint dusty smell. She unfolded the card. It said, "Check the cornerstone. South wall, east end. Look low. You'll know it when you see it." She went outside with the card in her hand. The cornerstone on the east end of the south wall was a big, flat-faced piece of river granite lower course protected by the overhang above. She crouched down with her face close to the stone, there cut into the granite in small, careful strokes. A V, 1873. And below the date 4 more words. For the one who comes after. Nora sat back on her heels in the dust. 1873. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. Agnes would have been what? In her 30s. Young by the measure of the life she'd lived. Young enough that the person who came after didn't exist yet, was barely even an idea. Agnes had carved this before Nora's mother was born. She had built this wall, this specific wall with its south face and its heat bank and its slow warmth and its iron ribs and its climbing green. She had built it knowing she would never know who came after. Only that someone would. And she wanted that person to find it. And to know. Nora pressed both hands flat against the warm granite fingers spread wide, and the stone gave back the whole day's heat into her cold palms, and she sat there until the light went off the top of the hill and the valley below went blue and still. When she finally stood up, she wasn't grieving anymore. She was making plans. August came in hot and heavy and smelling like ripe things. The wall was full. Not just full. Extravagant. Embarrassingly, almost offensively productive in the way that proved a point nobody wanted to admit had been made. The vines had climbed past Nora's head by the third week of July and were pushing toward the eaves by the first week of August, thick-stemmed and dark-leafed and hung with fruit at every node. Red and orange and one stubborn yellow variety Agnes had grown from seeds so old nobody remembered where they'd come from. Nora picked every morning at first light, both hands full before the dew dried. She filled the big baskets and the small ones in the tin bucket she normally used for well water, and still the wall stayed heavy. More than she'd dreamed, more than she'd planned for, which was a problem she had never in her life expected to have, and which she approached with the same brisk practicality she applied to every other problem, which was figure out who needs this and get it to them before it rots. The answer came on the first Saturday of August at the Callaway market. She loaded the cart before sunrise, drove down the hill with both big baskets mounted high and a third one wedged between her feet on the footboard. She set up at the east edge of the market green under the elm because it was the only spot left and because she didn't want to be too visible. That plan lasted approximately 4 minutes, because a basket of ripe tomatoes in early August in Callaway was not a thing you could be invisible about. There were no other ripe tomatoes, not one. The bottomland fields were still weeks from color. And here was a young woman under the elm with 3 baskets of red fruit that smelled like summer at its peak, and the whole market turned slowly in her direction, the way sunflowers turn without knowing why. Greta Pell got there first. She was a broad, capable woman in her 50s who ran the kitchen at the Callaway River Hotel, the only real hotel on the gorge, the one that served the steamer passengers coming up from Portland. She didn't browse. She stood in front of Nora's baskets and looked at the tomatoes with the appraising eye of someone whose livelihood depended on having better ingredients than anyone else within 40 miles. "How much?" she said. Not a question, an opening position, Nora told her. Greta bought every tomato in all 3 baskets before 9 in the morning, paid without haggling, then looked at Nora with an expression that was almost irritated, the way people look when they've found something they needed and are annoyed it took this long. "Wednesday delivery," Greta said. "I can do Wednesday." "How many baskets?" 4, maybe 5. "I want all of them. The steamer passengers will pay anything for fresh in August." "You have no idea." Nora drove home with an empty cart and a full apron pocket and sat at the plank table and counted the coins into her grandmother's seed tins and felt something she hadn't felt since the burial, like the arithmetic might actually come out right. She paid 1/3 of the Greer debt that same week, walked into the mercantile and laid the coins on the counter, and watched Silas Greer's face do a careful thing the way a man's face does when he expected one number and got another. He took the money, made a mark in his book, smiled the smile that never reached his eyes. "Lucky season," he said. "Won't last. One cold night and you'll lose the lot." "Then it's a good thing I'm selling now," Nora said. She walked out. But the comments stayed with her, the way his comments always stayed. Not because they hurt, because they were designed to plant something, a seed of doubt in fertile ground. Greer was good at that. He had the particular skill of men who've learned that a woman's confidence is the first thing you undermine if you want her to make bad decisions. She wrote it in the ledger that night. He said won't last. He said one cold night. He was not worried about her failing. He was worried about her succeeding. She underlined that twice. The mockery at market had gone quiet by the 3rd Saturday. Not gone entirely, but quiet. The same women who'd laughed near the church wagons now came to look, then came to buy, then came to ask questions they asked in low voices as if they didn't want to be overheard asking. How do you get them to grow up the wall like that? What do you tie them with? Does the stone really hold the warmth past dark? Nora answered every question. Every single one. She didn't guard the knowledge like a trade secret. She didn't make people feel foolish for asking. She explained the whole thing, the barrel hoops, the twine grid, the heat bank of the stone, the dusk watering the way the cold ran downhill and pooled in the bottomland, while the wall stayed 10 degrees warmer than the open ground on a clear night. Because Agnes had taught her that too. Not in words, in the way she explained everything to everyone who asked. A woman who hoards knowledge, Agnes said once, is a woman who dies with full hands. What good is that to anybody? September arrived quietly, the way bad news sometimes does. It came with a change in the light first. The particular gold of late summer that is beautiful and melancholy at the same time, because you know it by now. You know what it means. You know what comes behind it. And then old Harlan stood up after Sunday service and said what everyone in the gorge already knew but hadn't said out loud. He was a man who had farmed the Callaway Gorge for 4 decades, lean and weathered and almost entirely out of patience with pretense. He stood up in the churchyard after the last hymn hat in his hand and said plainly, "I've smelled this air before, winter of 1879. Every man here who remembers 1879 knows what I'm talking about. Get your tender crops in, this week. Whatever's still green is going to stay green." He sat back down. The churchyard went very quiet. Nora stood at the edge of the crowd and felt the bottom of her stomach drop half an inch. Not because she was unprepared. She was more prepared than anyone in the gorge for exactly this. But because she heard the silence around her and understood what it meant. These families, these fields, acres and acres of green tomatoes that would never ripen. Squash still setting. Beans still filling out. A whole valley's worth of work about to die in a single clear night and nothing to be done about it. She drove home fast. She looked at the wall, still heavy with fruit, red and orange and that stubborn yellow, still weeks ahead of any field crop in the gorge. She'd been picking and selling since August. Most of it already harvested, already paid for, already in Greta Pell's hotel kitchen and on steamer passengers' plates 40 miles down the river. What was left on the wall would survive a frost. She believed that. She had to believe it, because she'd built the whole summer around it. But belief and certainty are different countries, and standing in the September yard with Harlan's words still in the air, she felt the distance between them. She went inside and picked up the ledger, ran her thumb down the temperature record she'd kept since June. Wallstone at 10 p.m., Wallstone at midnight, open ground at same hour. The difference averaged 12 degrees on a clear night. On the coldest clear nights, closer to 15. The frost line for tomatoes was around 32 degrees. If the open ground hit 32, the wall would be at 44 or 47. The math was right. She'd run it 100 times. But Silas Greer's voice was in her head. Won't last. One cold night. She closed the ledger, went back outside, put her hand flat on the wall stone at 5 in the afternoon, the last hour of full sun, and felt the heat the stone had been drinking all day, deep and slow and certain, like something that had made a promise. She went back inside and started planning for what came next, which was when the first basket of tomatoes got destroyed. She'd left the cart outside Greer's on a Wednesday morning while she ran an errand to the land office, a 10-minute absence, no more. When she came back, the full basket on the cart seat was on the ground, upended. The fruit ground into the dirt in a way that was thorough, deliberate. Not a dog. A dog would have eaten them. Not a child. A child would have taken one and run. This was the work of someone's boot heel. Multiple passes. Every tomato ruined. She stood over the mess and kept her face still and thought accident. Loose dog. Careless wheel. She thought that hard for about 30 seconds. Then she stopped thinking it because it wasn't true, and she knew it wasn't true, and she'd spent too much of the summer being honest with herself to start lying now. She picked up the basket, drove home, wrote it in the ledger. Wednesday, September 4th. Full basket destroyed outside Greer's. Boot damage. Not accidental. 4 days later, the lure net was cut. She found it in the morning. A clean slice through 18 inches of twine low on the wall where a person could reach without a ladder. A heavy vine had pulled free overnight and lay in the dirt below the wall, 3 weeks' worth of set fruit bruised and split and already drawing flies. Not torn. Cut. The ends of the twine were clean as a whistle, the way twine looks when a sharp blade goes through it in one pass. Nora stood in front of the cut ends for a long time. Her hands were cold. Not from the morning air. She tied the vine back as best she could, salvaged what fruit she could, said nothing in town. But that night she went to bed with the window cracked and lay still and listened to the dark outside for a long time before she slept. She started sleeping lighter. 3 days after that, Eli showed up on a Wednesday with a look on his face she hadn't seen before, quiet and careful and carrying something he was deciding how to say. Ada went to find the toad in the bean rows. Eli waited until she was out of earshot. "Greta Pell told me something," he said. "About Agnes." Nora set down the twine basket. "Tell me." And he told her. Greta had known Agnes for 30 years, had been in certain ways her closest friend in Callaway, the kind of friendship that forms between women who are both too capable and too direct for most social circles, who find each other by a kind of gravity and don't require much tending. She knew things about Agnes that nobody else in the gorge knew, including the thing that Greta had never spoken out loud in nearly 20 years. In the spring of 1873, Agnes Vane had served as midwife for the birth of Silas Greer's first child. His wife Edna had labored 2 days. The baby came at last, turned wrong, the cord wrapped tight. Agnes had done everything a skilled midwife could do. Everything. Greta was there. She saw it. The baby didn't live. Couldn't have lived. The cord had been wrapped before labor began, and there was no medicine then or now that changes what a cord wrapped that tight does to a child. Agnes carried it the way she carried everything, quietly, as a professional sorrow, a thing that happened that couldn't have been prevented that you mourn and return from. Silas Greer did not carry it that way. He didn't accuse her publicly, didn't bring her before any authority. He was too careful for that, too controlled. What he did was quieter and slower and in some ways worse. A word here, a doubt there, a gentle suggestion to this neighbor and that one that perhaps Agnes Vane was getting old. Perhaps her methods were not what they should be. Had anyone noticed that the Hadley baby had a difficult month after Agnes delivered it? Had anyone heard about the Presson woman? Nothing you could grab hold of, nothing that could be argued against. Just fog. Just the slow accumulation of small doubts that over years become a reputation. By 1880, Agnes had stopped delivering babies in Callaway, not because she chose to stop, because the calls had stopped coming. Eli finished and was quiet. Nora stood with her back to the wall and looked at the Callaway Valley spread out below the hill and thought about a woman she'd believed she knew completely and was only now beginning to understand. "She never said a word," Nora said. "Greta says she thought about it for a long time. But Greer had money and standing, and she had her land and her garden and her seeds. She decided the fight wasn't worth what she'd lose. And then she left the land to me and carved your name in the cornerstone before you were born," Eli said. "Yeah." Nora looked at the cut twine on the wall, the bruised fruit, the boot-shaped ruin in the dirt under the trellis, and now she understood. This wasn't about debt. Debt was the instrument. This was about Agnes Vane, who had been too good at her work and too unwilling to be owned, and who had died with her land intact and her dignity intact, and whose granddaughter was now standing on that same land, proving the same thing all over again, that a Vane woman on that hillside didn't need Silas Greer's permission to survive, and he could not stand it. He had waited 15 years to buy the land from Agnes. Agnes had died before he could. And here was Nora, 22 years old, half the valley starting to come up the hill on Saturdays, to look at the wall, a wall that worked better than anything the bottomland had tried in 30 years of planting, and the debt shrinking month by month, and Greer's story about luck and cold nights getting harder to sell. She made herself say the rest of it out loud. "He needs my wall to fail," she said, "before the frost comes and proves it works." Eli looked at her. "Because if the frost comes," she went on, "and the valley loses its crops, and my wall stands." She stopped, started again. "Then I'm not a lucky girl with a strange garden. I'm the woman who figured something out that every farmer in the gorge needs to know, and I don't need his credit anymore, and neither does anyone else who builds a wall." Eli was very still. "He doesn't need the frost to miss you," he said slowly. "He needs your wall gone before the frost proves it works." She looked at the cut twine. "The basket wasn't a warning," she said. "It was practice." 3 days after that conversation, Silas Greer came up the hill. First time he'd come himself since that initial April visit. He drove up the slope on a gray Thursday afternoon, watch chain swinging, and stood in the yard and looked at the wall with an expression she wasn't prepared for. Not the careful smile, not the controlled stillness. Something raw, something that had been locked up for a long time and was starting to press against the inside of the door. Want and fury, both at once. Like a man looking at something he'd convinced himself he deserved and couldn't understand why he didn't have it. "I've come to be neighborly," he said. His voice was perfectly steady. "The frost is close. Harlan's not wrong about the air. I'm making my offer final. Debt forgiven. $300 cash. You walk away clean before the weather decides for you." Nora stood in the yard and looked at him. He spread his hands. "A young woman alone. A freezing hillside. Be sensible." "My wall isn't freezing," she said. "You can feel it yourself. The stone's warm right now." "Sentiment." His voice sharpened at the edge. "Your grandmother filled your head with old woman's notions, and now you'll lose the land to them." "You're trying to buy me out before the frost proves you wrong," Nora said. "Aren't you Mr. Greer?" The yard went very quiet. She watched his face. Something moved behind his eyes. There and gone. But she saw it. He recovered. Smoothly, the way he always recovered. "Mind your tongue," he said. "You owe this store money. Debt's come due." He climbed back into the buggy. 3 days, he said without turning around. "Pay the full balance or sell. Those are the roads." He drove down the hill. Nora stood in the yard until the sound of the buggy died out. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with fury. The same fury she understood that had probably shaken her grandmother's hands in this same yard for 20 years. She went inside, sat at the table, opened the ledger. She wrote down every word of the conversation. Every word. She slept badly again that night. The wind had shifted to the north, and the stars were sharp and close, and the particular clarity of the sky above the gorge said everything old Harlan had been trying to tell the valley for 2 weeks. She lay in the rope bed and listened and calculated and did the arithmetic she'd been putting off. If the frost came this week, if the open ground hit 28 degrees, if the wall held to its average of 12 degrees warmer than the open field, if the net was intact and the iron ribs were sound and the vines were still tied and no one had. And then she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small scraping sound against stone, the kind of sound that could be a branch or an animal or the cabin settling in the cold. She lay still and listened. Then she heard it again. Metal on stone. Not settling. Not a branch. A specific sound. The sound of something being pried. She was out of bed before she'd decided to be. Feet on the cold floorboards. Coat over her nightdress. Lantern from the hook by the door lit in the dark by feel because she'd done it 100 times. Out the door. The lantern threw its circle of yellow light against the south wall. A figure on the trellis. High up. Both hands on the iron ribs. A knife in the belt. For 1 second nobody moved. Then the figure dropped. Hit the ground and ran for the trees at the east edge of the property. Fast. Gone into the dark before she'd taken 3 steps. She didn't chase him. She stood in the yard with the lantern and made herself look at the wall instead. The damage was the worst yet. A long section of the upper trellis, the section she'd built first the widest part of the net, had been slashed through in 4 places. The iron hoops along one course had been pried half off the stone. At least 24 vines had lost their purchase. They hung loose in the cold air, heavy with fruit bending slowly toward the ground under their own weight. She could see where 3 of them had already torn free. The fruit lay in the dirt below pale shapes in the lantern light. This wasn't vandalism. This was surgery. Whoever had done this had known exactly which section to cut to cause the most structural damage. Knew how the trellis worked. Knew where the weight of the fruit would do the rest of the work once the net was opened. This was someone who had studied her wall. She wanted to sit down in the dirt and cry. She almost did. Instead, she set the lantern on the ground and got on her knees in the soft earth at the base of the wall and started looking. The ground under the trellis was soft. She watered at the roots every evening, and the soil was still damp from yesterday. In the lantern light, she could see boot prints clear as pressed wax. Multiple passes, back and forth along the base of the wall, one set distinct from the others. She brought the lantern close. Left heel. A wear pattern she'd seen on town boots, not field brogans. And there on the heel of the left boot a repair, a half-moon-shaped piece of leather, slightly darker than the original sole, tacked on by a cobbler. Clean work, recent work, a town boot, a mended town boot, a merchant's boot. She did not make assumptions out loud, not even to herself, not yet. She did the thing the ledger had trained her to do, which was record what she could see and separate it from what she believed. She found a flat board near the woodpile and laid it gently over the clearest print to protect it from the morning dew. Then she went inside and lit the table candle and got the ruler from the shelf and her best pen and sat down. She drew the print to scale, the length, the width, the particular shape of the toe. The heel repair half-moon, left side fresh leather, slightly raised at the outer edge where the tack had been driven. She wrote the time, the description of the damage, the direction the figure had run. She wrote it all down the way Agnes had taught her to write everything down. Then she sat back and looked at what she had. Outside, the north wind was picking up. The stars were very bright and very close, and the temperature was dropping in the particular way of the worst frost nights, the kind of drop that feels like the sky has made a decision and intends to keep it. She put her hand flat on the south wall beside the table. Through the window she'd left an inch open all summer for air. The stone was still warm, even now, even with the night this cold. The wall had been drinking heat for 14 hours, and it was not done giving it back. She closed the window, blew out the candle, and sat in the dark with her back against the warm stone and her ledger in her lap, and waited for the morning to come. The frost arrived before dawn. She felt it before she saw it. The air coming under the door had a weight to it, a stillness, the kind that isn't peaceful, the kind that means everything alive outside has gone quiet because something is happening that they can't stop. She sat with the ledger and the boot print sketch and did not sleep, because there was too much to think about, and because tomorrow she had exactly 3 days until Greer called the debt, and because somewhere in the dark outside her wall was either holding or it wasn't. And she would not know until the sun came up. The sun came up white, not golden, not the warm amber of a September morning that has any kindness left in it. White. The flat, hard white of a sky that has done something overnight and is not apologizing for it. Nora opened the cabin door and stood on the step and looked at the valley. Gone. All of it. The bottomland fields had turned the color of a bruise. Dark green to brown black in a single night, the way frost takes things, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once like a decision. Acres of tomato vine lying flat against the earth. Squash leaves collapsed into themselves. The bean rows that old Harlan had spent the better part of May planting in careful furrows dead to the root before breakfast. She made herself look at her own ground first. The kitchen garden. The sensible row crop she'd planted in April to be safe, the traditional ground rows her grandmother had always kept, the ones she'd told herself were the real crop, while the wall was just an experiment. Dead. Black-stemmed and slumped. Every one. She walked the perimeter of the property in the frostlight. Her breath came in small clouds. Her feet went numb through her boots in the first 10 minutes. She kept walking. And then she got to the wall, the slashed section. The long upper section where the figure in the dark had cut the net open in 4 places and pried the iron ribs and let the vines hang loose and heavy and unprotected against the night. She looked at it straight on and didn't flinch. Dead. Black and wilted and exactly as dead as the bottomland fields below. The frost had found the opening in the net the way cold water finds a crack instantly. Completely. 24 vines, maybe more, hanging limp and dark against the stone where 3 days ago they'd been the greenest things in the gorge. She stood in front of the ruined section for a long time, long enough for her feet to stop hurting from the cold because they'd gone past hurting into just numb. 3 days. Debt called in full. The row crop dead. The wall breached. She sat down in the white grass. Just sat. Not because she was giving up, not yet, but because the weight of it was real, and she had learned from Agnes that you didn't outrun the real weight of things. You sat down under it and you felt it, and then you decided what to do. So she sat in the frost and felt it. She thought about the $300 Greer had offered, about the debt forgiven, about Portland and a decent room somewhere, and a job in a shop or a school or anywhere that wasn't 3 acres of rocky hillside that half the valley had spent 6 months laughing at. She thought about her grandmother's hands pressing hers against the warm chimney stone. She thought about AV 1873. For the one who comes after. Agnes had carved that in the year she lost everything that wasn't hers to keep. The year Greer had started his quiet war against her name. And instead of taking whatever was offered and walking away clean, she had picked up a chisel and carved a message to a person who didn't exist yet. To Nora, who was sitting in the frost right now deciding whether to honor it. She sat until her feet were completely numb, and then she stood up. And she made herself do the one thing grief wanted her to skip. She looked at the rest of the wall, not the ruined section, the whole wall, the uncut, unbreached, untouched sections that ran the full length of the south face from the ruined part all the way to the east corner where Agnes's name was carved in granite. She looked, really looked. The way Agnes had taught her to look at the ground every morning, not for what she expected to find, for what she hadn't seen yet. And she stopped breathing. The tomatoes were red, hundreds of them, hanging full and whole and undamaged against the warm stone, the color of fire in the white frost light, every vine intact and every fruit perfect, the whole unbroken sweep of the south wall alive and loaded in the middle of the deadest morning the Callaway Gorge had seen in 13 years. The frost had missed every vine the wall protected, every single one. Only where the net had been cut open, only where a man with a town boot and a fresh-mended heel had pried her work apart in the dark had the cold gotten through. Everywhere the wall stood whole, the stored heat of the stone had held the killing temperature off through the night exactly as her grandmother had said it would. She walked to the east corner and put both hands flat against the granite. Warm. Genuinely warm. At 7 in the morning after the worst frost in over a decade, the stone had been drinking heat for 6 months, and it had not given all of it up in a single night. Not even close. She pressed her hands harder against the stone, and underneath her left palm she felt the carved letters of V, 1873, for the one who comes after. She stood there a long time. Then she went inside and picked up the ledger. She had 3 days. A ruined row crop. A wall that was alive and loaded with proof, a boot print under a board, a forged contract, and one woman in Callaway who had been waiting almost 20 years for someone to ask the right question. She had enough. She drove to Eli's forge before 9. He was at the anvil when she came in. Ada on the crate with a picture book, the cat finally resigned to the child's existence and sitting 3 inches from her knee as if this had been its idea all along. Eli looked at Nora's face and set down his hammer. "How bad?" he said. "The breached section is gone. Everything else lived." He was quiet for a moment, processing that. "Every field in the valley died last night," he said. "Yes. And your wall stood. Every inch they didn't cut." Another silence. The forge ticked. "So the cut section and the living section are side by side," he said slowly. "Yes. Which means anyone who looks at your wall today can see both things at the same time, what the wall does when it's whole, and what happens when it's opened up." Nora looked at him. "It's not just proof the wall works," she said. "It's proof someone tried to stop it from working." Eli sat down on the bench, put his elbows on his knees, thought. "You can't accuse him outright," he said finally. "Not with just a boot print. He'll say 100 men wear mended heels." "I'm not going to accuse him," Nora said. "I'm going to let the wall do it." She told him the plan. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to understand about Eli Dowd over the course of the summer. He listened the way he worked completely, without half his attention somewhere else. When she finished, he said, "You'll need Greta. I'm going to her next." "She'll do it," he said. "She's been waiting for this longer than you know." Nora looked at Ada, who had put the picture book down and was now listening with the complete, unguarded attention of a 6-year-old who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't. "Does she always do that?" Nora said. "Since she could sit up," Eli said. "She gets it from her mother." He said it simply, without the particular flinch that the mention of a dead wife sometimes carries when the wound is still fresh. Just a fact. Just a thing that was true about Ada and was also a way of keeping her mother in the room. Nora understood that. She went to Greta Pell. The hotel kitchen smelled like bread and wood smoke and the particular productive warmth of a room where someone has been working since 4 in the morning. Greta was elbow deep in pastry dough when Nora came through the back door. She looked up, read Nora's face. "Sit down," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." "I need to ask you something." "I know. Sit down anyway." Nora sat. The kettle went on. Greta kept working the dough with the methodical efficiency of someone who had fed hungry people for 30 years and knew that the dough waited for nothing. "He came to your wall last night," Greta said. Not a question. "Someone did." "And the frost came." "Yes." Greta worked the dough in silence for a moment. "Agnes told me once," she said, "that the hardest part of being right was being patient enough to let the proof catch up with you." She folded the dough, turned it. She was right about most things. She was right about the wall, Nora said. She was right about a lot of things nobody gave her credit for. Greta pressed the dough flat with the heel of her hand. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to tell me about the night in 1873. The kitchen went very quiet except for the kettle starting to sing. Greta stopped working the dough. Her hands stilled on the board, and for a moment her face had the look of someone standing in a room they haven't entered in a long time, checking whether the floor still holds. "All of it," she said. "All of it. In front of the whole valley, this Saturday." Greta looked at her for a long time. "He destroyed her practice," she said. "He took 30 years of work from a woman who had never done him anything but good, and he turned it to ash with whispers because he needed someone to blame and she was standing closest." "I know." "And she never fought back." "She left me the wall," Nora said, "and the ledger, and the cornerstone. She fought back the only way she could. She left the proof to someone who'd know what to do with it." Greta looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has held something heavy for a very long time and is being offered a place to finally set it down. "I have her original contract," she said. "The one she and I signed together. I kept my copy. Every word exactly as Agnes wrote it before she put her name on it." A pause. "The one Greer is showing you is not the same document." "I know that too." "I was at Colley's cobbler shop 2 weeks ago Tuesday," Greta said, "standing right next to Greer when he had his left heel patched. Half-moon piece of leather. I watched Colley tack it on." The kettle was fully singing now. Neither of them moved to take it off. "Saturday," Nora said. "Saturday," Greta said. She went back to the dough. Nora and Eli spent the next 2 days spreading word. Not as gossip, not as drama. As an invitation, plain and direct, the same message to every household in the gorge. Come see the one crop that survived last night. Come see how it was done. Saturday morning at the Vane place on the North Hill. Free of charge. It was under the circumstances not a difficult invitation to accept. Every farmer in the Callaway Gorge had woken Friday morning to dead fields. 3 weeks of September left and no harvest to show for the summer. Empty root cellars going into a winter that had announced itself early and with no interest in negotiation. When you've watched everything you planted die in a single night, you will drive a long way on a Saturday morning for the sight of something alive. They came. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of wagon wheels on the hill road, one after another, the particular music of a community in motion. She was standing at the foot of the south wall when the first wagon crested the rise, and she stayed there while the yard filled up around her. The Sunfeld family. The Octors. Old Harlan with his hat in his hand and his 4 decades of knowledge in his eyes. The bottomland families she'd never spoken to directly. The boys who had shouted wallweed at her in July, who now stood at the edge of the crowd with the self-conscious quietness of young men who are beginning to understand that they were wrong about something. Greta Pell, standing near the back, straight-spined with Agnes's original contract folded in her coat pocket and 30 years of knowing the truth in her face. Eli at the east corner, Ada beside him, the child holding his hand without being told to, and Silas Greer at the back of the crowd, arrived last, which meant he'd driven fast to get here after hearing the invitation had gone out. Watch chain bright in the September morning, face controlled and still. He'd come to watch the wall fail, which meant he hadn't seen it yet. Nora looked at all of them, took a breath, Then she started walking and let them follow. She didn't perform. She didn't raise her voice. She walked the length of the south wall slowly the way she walked it every morning, and she told them what they were looking at. Stone absorbs heat all day, she said. South facing it gets the full arc, and it doesn't let it go fast. You know this already. You've all put your hand on a chimney stone an hour after the fire died. The heat is still in there. This wall works the same way. A heat bank. Slow to warm, slow to release. She let them look at the living wall. Hundreds of red tomatoes. Full and perfect and hanging heavy in the cold morning light. Ripe. Whole. The only ripe tomatoes in the Callaway Gorge. A murmur moved through the crowd. The particular sound of people who came prepared to be skeptical and are finding it harder than expected. Cold rolls downhill, Nora continued. You all know that too. You've lost beans to it. June night's clear sky, the frost hits the bottomland first because cold air is heavy and it drains to the low ground. Up here against the warm wall above the cold pool, the frost line is lower. The wall holds 10 degrees of difference, sometimes 15. Last night it was enough. She paused. Let them stand with that. Let old Harlan put his hand flat against the stone the way she knew he would. Let her watch his weathered face change. The skepticism not leaving exactly, but making room for something. I'll be damned, he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just to himself and the warm stone and the dead valley below. Then Nora walked to the ruined section. She stopped in front of the slash marks, the pried iron ribs, the black dead vines hanging against the stone where everything around them was alive. And here, she said, is what happens when the wall is opened up. The crowd got very quiet. This is not wind damage, she said. The twine was cut with a blade, 4 separate cuts. The iron ribs were pried from the mortar with a tool. Someone came onto this property 3 nights ago in the dark and opened my wall before the frost so that when you all stood in your dead fields this morning, this wall would be dead too. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. So you would never know it could have saved your crop. The quiet changed temperature. You could feel it. The shift in the air of a crowd when it moves from watching to understanding. I don't accuse anyone without evidence, Nora said. I'm not standing here to call a name. I'm standing here to show you what I found. She reached down and lifted the board she'd placed over the print 3 nights ago. The boot print in the soft earth, preserved by the board from the frost, sharp and deep and clear in the morning light. She placed her ruled sketch beside it. Drawn to scale that same night with the table candle burning and her hands steady because she'd made them be. Town boot, she said. Left heel mended by a cobbler. Half moon of new leather fresh tack line along the outer edge. She looked up at the crowd. I'm not naming anyone. I'm asking the person who made this print to step into it, that's all. Just step in. Show the valley your boot. Nothing moved. And then Greta Pell walked through the crowd. She moved the way a woman moves when she has made a decision she is not going back on. Unhurried, completely certain. She stopped in front of the boot print and turned to face the crowd. I was present at the birth of Silas Greer's first child in the spring of 1873, she said. Her voice carried, clear and steady and with no interest in softening what it carried. Agnes Vane delivered that child. I was in the room for both days of that labor. Agnes did everything a midwife could do, everything correct and everything right. The cord was wrapped before labor began. No one, not Agnes, not any physician in the territory could have saved that baby. The crowd was very still. Silas Greer spent the next 7 years destroying Agnes Vane's practice with whispered doubts and careful suggestions, Greta said. He did it quietly enough that no one could grab hold of it. And Agnes, a pause, the smallest one, Agnes let him, because she had her land and her seeds and she chose the land over the fight. She reached into her coat pocket and brought out a folded document. This is Agnes Vane's original loan contract, the one she and I signed together in 1889. I witnessed it. I kept my copy. Every term exactly as written. She looked at Nora. It does not contain any fee for carrying charges or administrative extension. Not one line. She turned back to the crowd. I was also at Cawley's cobbler shop 2 Tuesday mornings ago, she said. Standing at the counter when Silas Greer had his left boot heel repaired. Half moon of leather, new tack line. I watched Cawley do the work. Every head in the yard turned to the back of the crowd. Where Silas Greer stood with his watch chain in his controlled face and his town boots on the cold ground, the silence was enormous. Nora said nothing. She had said everything she needed to say. She looked at Greer and waited. "Step into the print, that's all. Just step in." Greer looked at the print in the ground. He looked at the dead black vines above it, the ones his work had killed. He looked at the living red walls stretching away on either side of the ruined section. The proof arranged so plainly that even he couldn't improve on its clarity. And he looked at 30 households who had just understood in the space of 10 minutes that this man had tried to cut away the one thing that might have changed what their September looked like. Who also understood in the same breath that it had worked anyway. That a wall worked. That anyone with a south-facing stone wall and a summer's worth of barrel hoops and twine could have what Nora Vane had. That they did not need Silas Greer's credit to survive a frost. That they never had. He did not step into the print. He turned and walked to his buggy. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No shouting, no final words. Just a man walking across a yard full of people who were watching him go, and the watching was its own verdict. You could hear it in the silence, in the way nobody said anything or moved to stop him or called after him, because nothing needed to be added to it. Old Harlan waited until the buggy reached the top of the hill road and started down. Then he said loud enough to carry, "I'll be paying my full balance at Greer's this week and taking my trade to the new merchant in Redfield. Anyone wants to ride along, I'm leaving Tuesday." A low sound moved through the crowd. Not cheering, not celebrating. Something quieter and more serious than celebration. Agreement. The sound of people deciding something together without needing to put it to a vote. Greer's buggy disappeared below the hill. Nobody ran after him. For a moment the crowd just stood there in the September morning with the dead valley below them and the living wall in front of them and the particular stillness of people who have just watched something settle that had been unsettled for a long time. Then someone put their hand on the warm stone. Then someone else. Then a young mother lifted her child's small hand and held it flat against the granite, and the child looked up at her with a question, and she looked back with an answer that didn't need words. Nora watched that, stood very still, and watched it, because that was the moment, not the boot print, not Greta's testimony, not Greer walking away without stepping into the evidence. This moment. A child's hand on warm stone on the coldest morning in 13 years. The valley learning something that Agnes Vane had known for decades and had been prevented from sharing, learning it now from the granddaughter who had finished what Agnes began. Eli came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. He was looking at the wall the way he'd looked at it the first Wednesday he'd come to help, back when it was just a notion, and a few iron ribs, and a young woman with bloody knuckles, and a stubbornness she'd inherited without asking. "She would have liked this," he said finally. "Agnes." "Yeah." Nora looked at the carved cornerstone at the east end of the wall. "She planned for it," Nora said. "She planned for exactly this. She just didn't know when." Eli was quiet for a moment. "The debt," he said. "He won't call it." "You sure? A man the whole valley just watched, refused to put his boot in the dirt, has no power left to call anything." She said it the way she'd worked it out in her head at 3 a.m. with the ledger open and the candle burning. He needs the valley to stay afraid of him. The valley just stopped. Which turned out to be exactly right. Greer did not call the debt in 3 days. He did not call it in 3 weeks. He did not call it at all. By October, the trade had shifted. One household at a time, the way water shifts when the ground changes under it. Quietly, and then all at once, and then irreversibly. The new merchant in Redfield, a woman named Sable Pruitt, who had opened her store the previous spring and had been surviving on what little custom Greer hadn't monopolized, suddenly found herself with more business than she'd planned for. She hired 2 assistants before November. Greer's Mercantile closed in the 3rd week of October. The sign came down on a Wednesday morning. Nobody was there to see it as far as anyone could tell. Or maybe everyone was there and just happened to be looking the other direction at that particular moment. It's hard to say. Silas Greer left Callaway before the 1st of November, took his inventory and his ledgers and his watch chain and his patched left boot and drove out of the gorge without a farewell to anyone who mentioned it afterward. Nobody wept. Nobody said much of anything because what was there to say? A man who had built his power on other people's desperation, discovered that people stopped being desperate when they stopped needing him and stopped needing him, and that was the end of that. Nora paid the balance of the debt in full to the estate before it closed. Not because she had to, because she wanted the transaction to be clean. She wanted there to be a receipt with the date and the amount and her name on it, and she wanted to put it in the ledger next to everything else she'd recorded that summer. The full story, start to finish. In Agnes's handwriting on the cover page and in Nora's on every page after. She spent the autumn doing two things, harvesting and teaching. The harvest was better than she'd planned for because the wall had continued ripening through the cold October days, still warm enough on its south face to coax the last late fruit to color long after any field crop had given up. She delivered to Greta every Wednesday until November. The hotel cook from the landing bought a standing order through the end of the steamer season. The seed tins on the windowsill were full by December. And the teaching. That was the part Agnes would have recognized. The Callaway Gorge that winter had a particular industry to it, the kind that comes from a community that has learned something and is in a hurry to use it before the next frost season arrives. Half a dozen families had south-facing walls they'd never thought twice about. Now they thought about them. Now they came up the hill on Saturdays, sometimes two families at a time, and Nora walked them along the iron ribs and the twine web and explained the whole of it. The heat bank, the dusk watering, the way to train a vine so no leaf shaded another, and every fruit got the full benefit of the stone's warmth. She gave away seed from Agnes's tins, the fat-ribbed variety that Agnes had brought from somewhere east and never named. Good keepers, good climbers, good on warm stone. She showed old Harlan. The man crouched down in front of the east corner and read Agnes's carved initials with his hand over them, like a blind man reading. She knew, he said. For a long time, Nora said. And she never said. She didn't have the chance. By the time anyone would have listened, he'd taken her credibility. Nora looked at the carved date. So she left the wall, and she left it to someone who'd come after. Harlan was quiet. The way a man is quiet when he's doing arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers. I heard those whispers, he said finally. About Agnes. About the Greer baby. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands. I didn't start them, but I heard them and I didn't ask questions. Most people didn't. That's not an excuse. No, Nora said. It isn't. He put his hat back on. Tell me how to build one of these walls, he said. She told him. The orders for iron hooks came from Eli's forge all winter. He made them in batches, a new design Nora had sketched out for him in October, slightly larger than the barrel hoop method purpose-built for wall trellis, rather than improvised from cooperative salvage. He stamped each set with a small mark, a half circle, like the base of a rising sun, like the curve of a stone that had spent a day in the light. Ada asked him once why he made that mark. He thought about it. So people know where they came from, he said. Ada looked at the hook for a long time. Like Nora's wall, she said. Like Nora's wall, he agreed. The Wednesday visits didn't stop when the growing season ended. They shifted. Less construction, more conversation. Supper at the table instead of coffee on the porch step. Ada learning to bake bread in Agnes's kitchen, which had a better oven than the forge cottage, and which Ada had declared superior on all counts, and which Nora did not disagree with. Long evenings with the lamplight and the ledger and the seed tins and the comfortable wordlessness of two people who have stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. Nothing declared, nothing formal, just a man who kept showing up. Week after week without being asked, which Nora had learned by now was the rarest and most serious thing in the world. On the first morning of the following spring, Nora went out to the south wall before breakfast. The iron ribs were waiting, clean and ready and cold from the winter. The twine she'd taken down in November was coiled neatly in the basket by the door. The seed tins were lined along the windowsill. Agnes's labels faded to near nothing, waiting to be renewed. She pressed both palms flat against the south wall. Cold. Of course it was cold. It was March and the sun had only just cleared the ridge to the east and the stone hadn't had 6 hours of heat yet, let alone 6 months. But not as cold as the open ground. Already. Even in March. Already the stone was a degree or two warmer than the air around it, the way a thing holds on to what it's known even through the hardest season, The way memory works in objects and in people, slow to warm, yes, but slower still to let go. She heard the wagon on the hill road. Wednesday. She kept her hands on the stone and smiled at the wall in the way you smile when nobody's watching. The real smile, the one that doesn't need an audience. Behind her, she heard the wagon stop. The sound of Eli stepping down. The smaller sound of Ada dropping from the seat and hitting the ground running because Ada had never in her life stepped anywhere she could jump instead. Nora. Ada came around the corner of the cabin at full speed. Can I plant the first one? I want to do the corner because that's where it says the name. The corner is yours? Nora said. Ada pressed her small hands against the granite cornerstone, right where Agnes had carved her initials, right where Nora had pressed her hands all those months ago on the morning she understood what her grandmother had left her. It's cold, Ada said. It will warm up, Nora said. Give it the whole day. Come back tonight and feel it. Ada looked at the stone seriously, the way 6-year-olds look at things they have decided to believe in. Okay, she said, I'll remember. Nora looked at the child's hands on the stone and then at Agnes's carved letters beneath them, and then at the full long wall waiting for its first season with someone who understood what it was for. The rock doesn't lose the heat, Nora. It keeps it, quiet and long and without any fuss. And in the spring that followed, the Callaway Gorge planted differently. Not all at once. Not every farm. But enough. South-facing walls that had held nothing but shadow for 20 years wore their first iron ribs by June. The seed from Agnes's tins went into the ground in a dozen yards. The fat-ribbed tomatoes climbed wherever there was warm stone to climb. And in September, when the frost came again on a clear, still night, the valley woke to something it hadn't expected. Not total ruin, not a single color of dead, but patchwork. Here and there across the gorge south walls, standing warm in the frost, morning red against the white like small fires, nobody had let go out. Not enough to save everyone. Not yet. But enough to show what was possible. Enough for a man like Harlan to stand in his yard and look at his own south wall and feel the stone at 7 in the morning and nod once to himself the way a man nods when a thing he was told is true turns out to be true. Nora stood at her own wall at sunrise, palm flat on the warm stone, Eli beside her. Ada reaching up to pick the lowest ripe tomato still warm from the rock it had spent the night against and biting into it with the complete satisfaction of a child who has been promised something and found the promise kept. The juice ran down her chin. She looked up at Nora with red-stained hands. It worked, Ada said, as if there had ever been any question, as if Agnes had not been right about this for 50 years. As if the stone had not been holding the warmth all along through every cold season, every dark night, every quiet act of destruction aimed at the woman who first understood it and the woman who came after. Patient, certain, warm, waiting for someone to put her hand there and finally pay attention.